The most influential yet notorious wife of King Henry VIII was Anne Boleyn, and many historians have argued that she was the most significant consort that a king has ever had. Anne's marriage to the brutal and ruthless Henry VIII would send England into religious turmoil, as the king turned his back on the Pope and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. These changes to the Church caused chaos, as monks and priests could not support the changes, and the king for this ordered executions all across the nation. Peaceful people were brought to be hanged, drawn and quartered, and even the king's closest friends and most powerful advisers, such as Sir Thomas More, lost their heads on Tower Hill. But with all this uproar, Anne Boleyn herself would fall from grace spectacularly, and the king's chief adviser Thomas Cromwell would plot her downfall, and Anne the Queen was accused of adultery, treason and other charges, and she would then be condemned inside of the Tower of London. A French swordsman was imported across to England for the execution, and following the job being performed, Anne would be buried inside the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, a stone's throw from the execution site, as the chapel is also within the walls of the Tower of London. But her tomb and coffin would be broken into during the reign of Queen Victoria, and with this, what the royal doctor found was remarkable. Join us today as we look at opening the coffin of Anne Boleyn, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 19th of May 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn was summoned from her apartments, which had become her prison in the Tower of London, and a scaffold had been created which would serve as an execution platform for Anne's bloody end. She walked from her rooms to the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London, and was then led up the scaffold to greet the executioner, but in her final moments she was calm and had decorum. Many noted that she had a huge amount of grace, and when she got onto the scaffold she made a short speech to those witnesses who had gathered to witness a swordsman's work, and these included Cromwell and the king's illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy. Anne said in her speech, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good and gentle sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best, and thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me, to God I commend my soul." The French swordsman following this then readied himself, and Anne was instructed to kneel on the scaffold. She did not lay her head on a block, as would happen if the axe was used, and with this the French swordsman took off his shoes. He did this to conceal his movements, as Anne had been blindfolded, and she would not know which way her end was coming. The executioner grabbed his sword from the hay, and he would show this to the crowd, before he appeared from the direction Anne did not expect, and he swung the sword with such power and venom that her head came clean off in one strike of the weapon. After the executioner collected her gown and made off with this, and he would then return to France, but then the ladies in waiting of Anne, who were witnesses to the execution, collected her body and placed it inside of an oak chest, which was used for bow staves. They then together carried the remains along with the head into the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. They then buried Anne quickly in a hastily dug grave. However, in 1848, a historian during the reign of Queen Victoria was visiting the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, and he stated of the chapel that, "I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into a meeting house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery." The Tower of London's church and chapel had fallen into a terrible state, and the constable of the Tower, who was appointed in 1876, agreed that work needed to be done, and Queen Victoria herself consented to this, as she believed this was not a fit place for the burial of queens. The chapel also contained the remains of Catherine Howard and other prominent Tudor figures, and others who had lost their heads inside of the Tower of London or on Tower Hill nearby. Thousands of bodies were found under the floor, which was at the time sinking, and it was said of the work done on the chapel that, on removing the stones of the pavement it was found, that the resting places of those who had been buried within the walls of the chapel during the troublesome times of the 16th and 17th centuries had been repeatedly, and it was feared, almost universally desecrated. When the tower ceased to be a residence of the sovereign or a state prison, the chapel of St. Peter appears to have gradually come to be regarded too much in the light of a mere ordinary parish church, in which the interment not only of those who lived in the tower, but even of residents in the neighbourhood, was freely permitted. It is true that the bodies of those who had perished on the scaffold or died as prisoners within the tower's walls were buried, no doubt intentionally, in great obscurity, but even if some memorial stone had recorded their burial place, it is doubtful whether that would have protected their remains, for in the instance of three Scotch lords, Lovat, Balmerino and Kilmarnock, although their grave was specially marked by a stone, which is still preserved, it was found that their bones had been much disturbed, so much so indeed as to be beyond all possible means of identification. It is even feared that in some instances coffins had been designedly broken up and their contents scattered to make room for fresh occupants of the ground. However, during the work on the chapel's floor, the builders would exhume the bodies of many different people, including those who were executed, and they then believed they stumbled across the remains of Anne Boleyn. The archaeologists carefully exhumed Anne's remains, and they noticed a number of physical characteristics. It was obvious that this woman's remains had been beheaded, and that the oak coffin or chest that Anne had been placed in had disintegrated over the centuries following the burial. The Professor of Medicine for Queen Victoria, Dr. Frederick Muat, one of the most senior doctors in the country, was summoned to the Tower of London to examine these remains and then hopefully identify them. The slabs where Anne had been laid to rest had been lifted, and her body was found at a depth of just 2 feet. The doctor would describe the remains, and he said, "To a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been slender and of perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck." He then stated, "The bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed, round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot." Dr. Moat stated that the woman in this grave would have been around 5 foot to 5'3" tall in her life, and he confirmed that the head was severed from the body for this woman. This obviously narrowed down the true identity of the woman, as there were only a few women who were beheaded on Tower Hill or within the Tower of London, including Margaret Pole, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, and of course Anne Boleyn. He also stated that the neck of the woman was small, which Anne Boleyn was noted for, and he confirmed without doubt that he believed that the remains he analysed were of Anne Boleyn. The records of burials also confirmed the rough area of the remains, but Anne's body was then taken away, and it would then be stored inside of the Queen's house in the Tower in a lead box and container, which would become her new coffin. All of the skeletal remains were placed in these new coffins, and 5 months later the body of Anne Boleyn would be reinterred in a new grave and burial site, which was then clearly marked. On the 13th of April at midday, 7 men, including the chaplain of the chapel, gathered for the reburial of Queen Anne Boleyn. The bodies, along with Anne, that had been identified and had their identities confirmed by the royal doctor, were also placed in labelled lead coffins. The men watched as the boxes were reburied under the altar, around 4 inches below the surface, and note of the body's positions was taken. On top of where Anne was buried, a marble decorative floor tile marks where she is laid to rest, and she was interred below the communion table, and was buried between her brother George Boleyn and Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector of Edward VI and the Duke of Somerset. The men who came across the bones of Anne Boleyn had in their hands the remains of the most influential Queen Consort that a King of England ever had. The doctor of Queen Victoria was certain that this was Anne, and this was not confirmed via DNA, as this was not around at the time, but it is accepted that these remains were actually the Tudor Queen. Anne's coffin over time disintegrated, and she was not allowed to have a proper coffin, and was instead stuffed inside of an oak box, which was repurposed to contain a queen's body, as it had before been used to contain weapons and bows. It was not the burial for a queen that had such an impact on history, and she is remembered today as the most notorious of King Henry VIII's wives. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.